Good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to Jardine House and to today's panel discussion as we talk about the 50th year of this fantastic building, Jardine House. So I'm going to start with a few facts to let us settle in and tune into what we're talking about today. So built in 1973, Jardine House was the first skyscraper in Hong Kong, setting new standards for the city with its innovative design. It had the fastest lifts in Hong Kong. It was immediately recognized by the market for its 1,748 iconic circular glazed windows, and it's a core part of the central ecosystem, part of the elevated walkways attaching Jardine House to Exchange Square, the Post Office, Charterhouse, and beyond. And today, Jardine House also continues to play an important part in Hong Kong as a financial center, global financial center, and is home to 88 companies from around the world. But Jardine House is more than just facts and statistics. It means an awful lot more to the people that know it and associated with it. Its architects and designers achieved the very rare feat of transcending the typical relationship between individual and building. Yes, Jardine House represents Hong Kong as a strong part of the global financial system, standing confidently through times of unpredictability and volatility. But it also is part of the patchwork of memories that we all have in terms of our home here in Hong Kong. Many of you may remember arriving at the Star Ferry Pier when it was over in Edinburgh Place, and the first building that greeted you was, of course, Jardine House. And a generation will remember Spider-Man, who's over there, in 1979, swinging into Hong Kong to terrify everyone and scale Jardine House. And more recently, in May this year, fans of Jay Chou danced the night away as he performed at the harbour side. And those lucky enough to have corner windows in Jardine House were also able to have a rare glimpse of that very popular event. But for me, personally, Jardine House is also a very significant part of my life. It's a place of hard work, it's a place of fun, it's a place of some memorable parties and some not so memorable. I first walked into Jardine House 20 years ago as a corporate lawyer in Norton Rose, based on the 38th floor, where the firm still is today. Working on the IPOs and M&A transactions of the day. I weathered the global financial crisis in this building behind my porthole on the 38th floor. And in 2009, my journey with Jardine House continued when I was lucky enough to join Jardine Matheson. I was really looking forward to continuing my path and work life in Jardine House. I actually didn't read the terms and conditions of my employment contract in that much detail, because I was immediately dispatched to Quarry Bay, where after a 12-year probation, I was welcomed back to Central, where I'm now General Counsel for Hong Kong Land, based in Exchange Square, in the building right next door. So today we start the 50th birthday celebrations of this great building. And for me, I prefer to say 50 years young, rather than 50 years old. And why is that? The reason I think that is because this building remains best in class. It remains at the forefront of the decisions that our tenants make in why they want to locate into our buildings. And the reason for that is sustainability. Through the amazing work of our projects and property management team, Jardine House is BEAM Plus Platinum rated, which is one of the key decision factors that tenants make when they're choosing where to actually locate their offices. So it's a very important example, this building, of how existing buildings can really contribute to the sustainable operations of our city and our home. So to our panel discussion. Today we gather with experts in architecture, urban planning, and anthropology. And I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to our panelists Charles Lai, Eunice Seng, Raymond Fung, and Sarah Mui, and to our moderator, Anderson Lee, architect, educator, an overall great person to chat to. And thank you all in advance for sharing your knowledge and passion as we talk about Jardine House. But before I hand over to Anderson, I'd like to welcome two very special guests to this event. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very privileged to be joined by Mr. James Kinoshita, the architect and designer of Jardine House itself, and also by Mr. Henry Steiner, the graphic design guru responsible for creating the logos and branding of many, many famous places and organizations in Hong Kong, including Hong Kong Land and the important landmarks that we have in our portfolio. So a round of applause for these two gentlemen. I'd also like to welcome colleagues from Hong Kong Land, as well as from Jardines, and other members of the group, and also to everyone else who's taken some time out of their weekend to come and enjoy this fantastic event. I'm sure it will be very insightful, very enjoyable. So without further ado, I will pass over to Anderson, who will introduce his panel and take us through the discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anderson Lee. I'm the moderator for the event. First of all, thank you, Hong Kong Land, for inviting us, the panel, to come up here on a Saturday afternoon to share some of our thinking, research, scholarship, passion on this building, on its 50th anniversary. Let me introduce today's speaker, the panelist. To my right here, I have Professor Eunice Seng, architectural historian, PhD program director at HKU, also founding principal of Skill Collaborative, a very well-known architectural historian with us. And then next to Eunice, we have Charles Lai, also an architectural historian, got his PhD at HKU, a very avid contributor to writing about Hong Kong architecture history, especially in the modern era. So you can read a lot of the things written by Charles. Especially he has spent a lot of efforts on conservation and preservation, on meaningful and beautiful buildings in Hong Kong in the modern era. And then across, we have Sarah Mui, currently the chairperson for Hong Kong Architecture Center, co-founder and design director of One Bite Design Studios, very active member of the architecture profession, has contributed a lot of different beautiful design in the cities, as well as sit in many board and committees in the architecture profession. And then last but not least, we have Raymond Fung. Raymond has two lives, right? The former life is architect from ASD, has also responsible to a lot of buildings in Hong Kong here. Now Raymond becomes smarter. He has abandoned the architecture profession and becomes a very well-known artist. But nonetheless, I think he still likes architecture, so that's why he's here with us to talk about what he will talk about. Perhaps I will take only 5 minutes to just contextualize today's symposium. So, icon of Hong Kong and beyond. So this is a very straightforward definition on what icon means. Yeah. So I would like to draw your attention to number 2, famous person or thing that people admire and see as a symbol of a particular idea, way of life, as worthy of veneration. So that's what the quality to become an icon. So this is a very famous quote by Sir Winston Churchill. I'm sure that most of you have heard of it. We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. So it starts to kind of say that the building actually gain certain personality and characteristics that start to interact with us. So why all this fascination of this building? Is it because of the architectural quality, the uniqueness of it, the circular window, the structure system? All these are plausible and possible fascinations of it. Maybe the only and the most important reason we're fascinated by this building is because of its tallness, its sheer height. In the 1970s, 80s, it dominated the skyline. This is not a wrong slide. If you know who this person is, if you're an NBA follower, this person, this basketball player, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he's well known not only for his skyhook, but for his sheer height. Standing 7 foot 2 inches, over 2.2 meters, he dominated the NBAs at the time, which happens to be his active year aligned with this building. So he was active from 1969 to 1989. He was a sports icon. Together with a cultural icon, he was the first one to step across the boundary from basketball, from sports, to movies. Here, co-starring with our all-beloved Bruce Lee. Historical icon, Churchill. Sports icon, Jabbar. Cultural icon, Bruce Lee. So, very quickly, to summarize. So, an icon, to me, is beyond a thing. It is a person. Jardine House is more than just a thing or merely a building. It is a piece of architecture that has gained a larger-than-life personality. So today, this afternoon, we are trying to get to know this friend or new acquaintances a little bit better through the panelists. So without further ado, we'll start with Eunice.
Good afternoon. I'm post-Jardine, according to Anderson, who has split us into pre- and post-Jardine. However, pretty close. So I wanted to start with this image and to pick up on also what John had said earlier. And that is here, this is an image from South China Morning Post in February 1974. It was about 10 months after the building had officially opened the year before. And South China Morning Post reporter decided that they want to sort of placate everybody who has been guessing how many windows there were in the building. And finally they said, all right, everyone, we counted and it's 1,748. However, there are only 1,710 that are glazed. And the rest are not because there's a mechanical floor. And so no more questions, we answered this. And that's the article, and it's called The Great Window Count. Why? Because I have the task of opening the panel by by discussing 1973. I want to spend the next, I think, 4.5 minutes left to talk about 1973 and Jardine House, particularly the idea of architecture as a high-rise building and the notion of what that means in the world. So 1973 was a very momentous year. April 4th, the World Trade Center in Manhattan opened, 110th floor. On the right, Jardine House at the end of the month, April 29, opened. When it was open, it was called Connet Center. That was the original name. And for 7 years until 1980, it was the tallest building in Hong Kong and in Asia. It was just overtaken a little bit by Hopewell in 1980. So 1973 was a moment that the idea of the tower belonged to not only the city in which the tower was built, but also as part of a global network of finance that is signified, as Anderson had put it very well, signify international finance in the world. So the building industry, such as Otis in particular, celebrated this idea of the international and placed Jardine House as tallest building as its key advertising icon in all its advertisements. So they kicked it off, and the rest of the building industry followed suit. The pairing that is very popular is really the World Trade Center in Manhattan and Jardine House, both being opened in the same month in April 1973, and also, as you will see later, a very beloved building of Hollywood. So other buildings continued. So 1973 was a tallest building in the world year. So we have Sears, we have Montparnasse in Paris that was very controversial when it opened. And then we had, of course, Excelsior, which was the largest hotel with 1,000 rooms, also by Hong Kong Land that year. And meanwhile, back in Hong Kong, there were two major phenomena that came along with the building. One was it basically inaugurated a very complex elevated network system. I believe Charles is going to say more about that. At the moment when I want to draw your attention to the kind of mixed traffic on the ground, at the moment when Hong Kong's transportation was still a hybrid of hand-pulled rickshaw and automobiles, we see a building jump starting this promise of a new class of workers in Central District. And Otis also, as I had said, presented in its advertisement, they chronicle every month by month the building of one building. This is quite unprecedented in Otis' own advertising history, I have to say. And it was to anchor its Asia-Pacific network. So I want to shift to how these towers very much became cultural icons the minute they were opened. 3 years after World Trade Center on the top was open, King Kong conquered it. And 3.5 years after Jardine House was open, Shaw Brothers' mighty Peking Man, because of copyright, they couldn't call it Kong, also conquered that. And so I want to draw your attention to how the cities are represented. I teach a class that analyzes architecture in the context of film, and it's very particular that while Manhattan was presented in a kind of sinister, the monster climbing it, Hong Kong was, in the 70s, presented as a very promising, bright, and a modern city. So you can see from both the dialogue and the way they are presented that, so there is Kong climbing World Trade Center, and Utam, the Hong Kong equivalent of Kong, climbing the Jardine House. So Hollywood and continue to be fascinated with, and actually Asia as well. But I just want to close with a number of these that both, as earlier mentioned, The Amazing Spider-Man, particular series on the Chinese web, and also the novel turn movie Noble House, where Pierce Brosnan, very young Pierce Brosnan, was the lead as the taipan that occupied the Jardine House. I want to draw your attention to how the building very much begin with the opening shot, and it is one way for those of us who are fascinated in the history of a city to actually understand it, and that is through the film and through how the film engage and situate the building. So the mighty Viking Man and how it introduced Hong Kong City, the Jardine House, is always an anchor in this. And finally, to end, the Dark Knight, closer to our present. I want to kind of show, if you can't see where Jardine House is, so in this completely fictional montage of, it's not Hong Kong per se, it's a montage city, dystopian city of the future. We see Jardine House being duplicated in a sort of multiplicity to suggest that Hong Kong being the context of a future modernist city that is part of this Gotham narrative. However, this is not the only vision that I want to end you with. In reality, Jardine House is standing strong after 15 years, still as new as it was presented in the 70s. I believe it's very well poised to lead another phase of urban development as it had, one that hopefully reimagines how innovative, well-built buildings of the city's recent past, and by that I mean 50 to 70 years, that they can play an important part in a global city sustainably. And it's in a way an appeal and an expectations, and perhaps it's time to make a different kind of movie, one that's not dark, but returning to the bright 1970s. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. I think a lot of you might be wondering why I chose this image as my first slide. It's not like showing any of the buildings in full. So on the left, of course, this is the base of the Jardine House, and then at the back, a lot of you might recognize it already. It's the fourth generation. General Post Office building that was built in 1978. And the angle is a little bit awkward as well. So it's not like those really formal, nicely framed images. I chose it for a very particular reason. This image, this photograph was actually taken by Andy Warhol while he was visiting Hong Kong and China in the 1980s. I believe this is the image before was a picture taken from the balcony of the Mandarin Oriental suite he was staying in. And I think probably one of the reasons why Andy Warhol took that image is because of the patterns that was given by these two buildings. So on the front, on the left-hand side, we see the iconic circular windows of the Jardine House, while on the back, we see the very formal, very strong architectural language of the General Post Office. And in many ways, I think, especially when we take a look at this image, this whole area in the late 1960s until the 1980s is really a symbol of the latest development of Central. So this map of the 1950s probably illustrates that idea even a bit more. This is a map, three-dimensional artist depiction of the Central in 1957. It was drawn by Law Ting Chow, an artist, and it was reproduced recently by the publisher being Hong Kong. And I think when we look at in the late 1950s, Hong Kong will immediately understand that the whole of Central is being surrounded, is being dominated by these Western, older-looking kind of building. But at the same time, we'll also see that at the promenade area, we see new buildings, new icons of the modern era coming up to the scene. This image is yet another illustration of that. The image on the right here, it's one that I like very much. It's an image of the office building, the Tuck Sing building, which unfortunately was demolished. But then on the side, the photographer chose to include it with as a contrast to the Tuck Sing building. On the building on the right, it's the sort of neoclassical facade of the previous generation, the third generation General Post Office building. And then this, of course, is yet another illustration of that beautiful kind of contrast between the old Hong Kong Club building with the neoclassical facade, and the new Hong Kong, the modernist designs of these new buildings coming up to the scene. And I really much like to draw your attention here on the image on the left. So these images, they are taken from a architectural and construction journal in the 1970s. This, I believe, is photographs taken during the construction of the building. I think the photographer did a very great job having the circular window as the frame, framing the neoclassical facade of the General Post Office, which is immediately behind the site of the Jardine House. Creating this kind of contrast and elevating the circular window as a kind of modern icon, symbolizing the modernization of Hong Kong and Central. So very quickly, this image is actually a device aiming to standardize the size, the dimensions of the circular openings, because as you might know, the facade, the walls on the outside of the building is actually part of the structural system. So it's constructed by reinforced concrete, but at the same time, it's quite difficult for those of you who might have experience in construction. It's quite difficult to control the dimensions of these kind of constructions. So they developed a special device so they can standardize all the dimensions of these openings and make sure that the window frames, the mullions, and the glass panes can be fitted perfectly. So I think this is one of the very beautiful moments of the design of the Jardine House. The trunk, the body of the building is mostly made up of these kind of repetitive circular patterns, while at the bottom we see the special movement, the whole wall, the facade of the building transitioning into these gigantic sculptural columns and opening up the lobby, the double height, double story interior spaces, while at the same time all these spaces was cladded by these very beautiful stone slates, the Borrington Moor slates, slightly greenish tints, very beautiful and very elegant kind of inside. I think that kind of contrast is something that is still very visible today in the Jardine House.
So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Sarah. Charles already gives a hint on what I'm going to talk about. So after talking about 1973 to I think the last photos that Charles showed was photographed in November 2022. So I'm going to bring you to the present with a set of photos from 2023. So which is today. But it's not as hot as today because it's a photo taken on a rainy day, which I believe is kind of the most romantic time to experience a Jardine House, and definitely not only the building itself, but the space around it. So this is my starting image of a front shot of Jardine House. But I like the way that whenever you take photos on the ground floor, you always find some trees or greens in your photos. So the layering is not, or the landscape design is not only for the building itself, for the people who is going to enjoy it. And this space, what fascinates me, is actually called the Connaught Place. So it's in between the post office and also the Jardine House. And in fact, I think it still owns the biggest water feature in the public area in Central, and definitely probably in Hong Kong as well. And I love the way that, because when it's designed, it's already part of the elevated walkway system in Central. So the landscape and the public space is not only designed for people to enjoy it on ground floor, but it tries to captivate you through different layers for people how to view it. And this water feature, another way why I feel that it's romantic, because it's not only moving with moving water, but yes, it's how you can actually feel it. So that's why I always love to come by when it's on a rainy day, because you can still keep yourself dry under all those canopies, but at the same time you start hearing the noises of the water, even with rain, and then with a few splashes on your body. So it's definitely a place where people can enjoy not only after work, but also in a weekend or in holiday. So the sensory simulation of this space is, I always found that it's a little bit pinned down by the iconic building of Jardine House. And so I'm sure after this sharing, I would invite you to go outside and experience it. And definitely, this is not only just a space for people to enjoy. I love the way that just two simple and bold gesture of the water pond becomes the stage of other for example, the artwork, which Raymond will be talking about it, and also framing the cities around it. And on the other hand, it also works with the architecture itself. So with the water pond, it creates a lovely reflection for all the people that walks in front of the facade, and also in fact, I feel that it exaggerates the double height lobby that is already there and is so significant. When you try to walk on the elevator walkway, the views are so different. Not only because you can see people walking down, but in a way when we look at how it's connected to the nearby spaces, it has so many entrances that you can actually enter Jardine House freely, so a very easy, friendly public space that we can enjoy. And I think at most of the time, you'll be seeing also how it connects you or to capture you through the double height lobby space, which is the last slide in Charles' part. And I love the way how our kids, they always love to climb there, sit there and looking outside, looking at the building or looking at the trees. I think this building and also the public space around it actually creates this multiple layers, and also how different ages, they can all see the icon of the city. And how trees come back at different angles. And I think the selection of trees also help us. Something that we always overlook is how the visibility and connectivity from the indoor and outdoor of the places as well. Because in every angle, you can see through something. It's not blocking you because it's a giant in the city. It's actually helping to connect you through this, I would say, a narrative of people enjoying the different spaces. And I think it's going to the last page as a transition to Raymond's part. I love the way that how we are not with the circular windows, but also in front there's an artwork, and how all these ground floor elements are going to frame the way you see the city, you see the buildings, or you see the people activities around. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this photo journal. Yes, and then I'll pass it to Raymond to start with.
Thank you. I'm the last, and also the least, because the least is always referring to art subjects, and it's never be paid attention by architects. That's why, being an artist, I do have an architect license, so make that sure. Well, talking about the list is because every time when architects do design, they never care where artworks, to put to, or where the sculptures to be dispositioned. So in many cases, particularly for myself, I always have to come across to choose some public works in public buildings. It never works right. It never works right. It's because the architects never had a chance to see what the subject is going to be, what the art subject is going to be in the correct disposition. Therefore, in the government, as a government architect for so many years, and I always get into trouble of putting the right thing into the right place. And therefore, what happened to here? There is an exception in Hong Kong. Hong Kong land makes an exception, I tell you, because only Hong Kong lands, I think, is the pioneer which started with putting the right thing onto the right place. Because I found that in many of the projects, they always care about where the sculpture should go and where the art pieces should be hung. And therefore, right in here, we have Jardine House. I think it's a very good example. Let's start with the slides. Everybody has talked about the architecture, so I talk about the art pieces. And when talking about the art pieces, I reckon that there has been some changes. I think it's just a number of years ago there has been some changes with the garden area, right? So I reckon that this is something that I wanted to address. Is I can see that, well, this is really a place that delineates so well between what we in architectural terms call solid and void. You see, the solid is the ground floor, and it's also the hard landscape, and the soft is the water. And in Chinese philosophy, we have yin yang, okay? So I think it's very good. It's a connotation and of where you can see the yang is the water area, okay? Is now I can see there are 8 pieces of sculptures. I don't know where they come from. Maybe somebody can tell me who is the designer, who's the architect, because I run around the whole place, I don't see any names. But I believe this must be coming up just a few years ago, because in the past it wasn't like this. It was a big splash of water. But now I will see this is a connotation of like some like candles floating on the water in tranquility. I think it's very, very nice piece, which is very poetic, to address the water, as well as to address the very important piece of master art by Henry Moore. Talking about Henry Moore, I'm sure Henry Moore is the number 2 person in Hong Kong that knows about the big artist in the world after Picasso, because that was in the year 1965. I don't know if you were born yet. I was in there. I don't know where I have met Henry Moore or not, but I'm sure that was the year that Hong Kong government held a solo for Henry Moore, and thereafter he became so popular, in the minds of Hong Kong people, and that was the year I was 13. So I got to know Henry Moore, being a big master. Is this Henry Moore sculpture, which is in such an organic form, is complements so well with the building, because the building itself is inorganic. But again, you can see this Henry Moore sculpture is in a pair. So it's also a connotation of balance and harmony, as well as seeing the 2 ovals, because it has given a name as double oval. And this double oval, I would say that it echoes so well with the thousands of windows of the building. Lovely. Here you can see this is the oval, and that is the window. So they actually complement so well. And also the materials. This is in bronze, and that one is aluminum. Of course, it wasn't in aluminum before, but I think that will be the question next. But in fact, today, it actually blends so well with something in gold, something in silver. Next to it, let's go inside the building. Now, inside the building, I think this were the 4 paintings installed somewhere like 15 or 16 years ago. I didn't remember exact date, but of course I know the artist myself, and of course he passed away. He's a very important person, is Mr. Hong Jifan, who was a printmaker before. He actually studied printmaking in New York, and later he migrated to Canada, but later he came back to Hong Kong. And I think his subject matter is spheres. If you have been, followed through his works, he has been doing that for many decades. It's always spheres. But being spheres is only subject matter, but he can do it in 1,000 ways, in different colors, in different chromatic approach, in different medias. And that's in here, 4 of them. The Making of a Sphere is the name of these paintings. They're together, 4 of them, The Making of a Sphere, 1, 2, 3, 4. Sitting on both sides of the wall of the main lobby. Then let's go further. Take a quick look at these areas with where the paintings go. Sphere 1, 2, and 3, and 4, they are all well proportioned, in front of the marble. Mr. Hong Jifan Making the Sphere, Crimson Cloud, number 3. And number 4 is Sweet Thunder. Now, in Hong Jifan's work, he wanted to emphasize its connotation of perfection and unity. But to me, I think is the roundness, it's a sphere. It actually addresses the circles of the Jardine House, because the artist is always doing big things in round. Let's go upstairs. We're just talking about somebody already passed away, but now we have a living artist. Her name is Java Lam, and also I know her. And actually, I talked to her when I was given this task to talk here. And she reminded me, you have to speak to the floor here. This is not bronze. This is wood. I said, I didn't know that. I thought it was bronze. Oh, she reminded me this is wood, because she keeps telling me that she is an environmentalist. She is recycling materials from wood, from timber, from a tree, the Lonix regia, from her food tan workshop. So she got that tree, rescued a tree from somewhere, I don't know, and she did it in Fortan, which is her workshop, and she created this piece of work. Title is Rejuvenate Bonsai. You can see there are some tricks or some things or like branches in the growing out. This is the idea that is what her blessings to Hong Kong land, longevity. So I think it's really a warm blessing to Hong Kong land being for everlasting in Hong Kong. So keep on, go to the last one, which is the list one. There's a painting here. This painting was a commission work in 1992. And this painting was commissioned by Jardine Matheson's big boss. And he wanted this work to be a painting of landscape of Hong Kong. Why? I think it's a reminiscence of Jardine's connection with Hong Kong, since Hong Kong's birth, talking about 150 years ago. So he wanted to be on right at the middle of the Jardine headquarters lobby. Very sadly, this has been there for 31 years. Seems like no one noticed who's the painter until today. I'm here. My heartfelt thanks to Jardine for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, all the panelists. So there you have it. Now, from Eunice, the more global context of situating Jardine House in the sea of skyscrapers of the world, and putting Hong Kong, this building on the map, tallest building with all the innovative technology. Then a little bit going more local to Charles on more the local context and impact that the Jardine House exerted or emits as a building. And then going closer to the immediate surrounding of Jardine House, right? Is urbanity, I call it. It's connectivities and defining the role Jardine House plays in the central urbanism. And then we're going further into the inner beauty of the building, which is all the artwork in the building, inside the building, and surrounding the building that frames the building and celebrate the building. So that's the range of sharing the panelists has put forth for us to think about. Like what I have suggested at the very beginning, I personify this building. So there's a certain characteristics and personality that this building means to different people. One of the things that I can't help when I listen to all the panelists is the word sensitivity. It's both the sensitivity of the client, Hong Kong Land and Jardine House, to commission the architecture of it, this unique architecture, as well as the artwork, like what Raymond have shared, right? The sensitivity of commissioning certain art pieces that goes very well with the building. So at this point, I would like to open up little bit more kind of sharing and discussion, probably from the panelists first, and then afterwards we have some Q&A from the audience today, and maybe you have some thoughts and some thinking after seeing the slides, because I think the slides that Sarah, for example, has put together. It requires the sensitivities of the people taking the picture and reading the building, because like what I said, it symbolizes a lot of different things, this building. For a lot of people have different memories of it, different interaction of it. Therefore, the iconic nature of the building comes from how it talks to you on a daily basis. So with that, maybe I first would pose a question to Eunice, right? Because Eunice saying that there's certain cultural aspect of it through movies, how the building is being perceived, right? Internationally through movies, right? One of the things that casually when I was chatted with Eunice, she was saying that when you look at all these kind of either King Kong movie or superhero movie, there's always a building that the villain or that they want to conquer. Right, so this is the Jardine House was one of this iconic symbol that kind of begin to put, Hong Kong commercial architecture and that kind of presence to the world map, to the world scene, right? Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more, and then let the audience to have some response and feedback.
Maybe I'll just say very quickly that. As soon as a building is completed, in fact, in this case, because it's so dominant in the waterfront, even during construction, it was already public in so many ways. And so what's really interesting is that because I don't think as an office building it intended to be a cultural icon. However, it's unavoidable that a building of this scale and also significance get picked up. And actually, it first appeared in a novel before it, so like Noble House, for example. And I have given a 2-hour talk on this, so I do not want to really get there, but if anyone's interested after, to really look at its presence in many, many films. I'm only really showing a sampling. Just as Woody Allen introduced Manhattan always, and there's certain so-called icons now that always invariably appear to anchor a place. Jardine House is one of those. So interestingly, compared to HSBC, maybe because it's more setback, the Jardine House is still a much more prominent one. So another one that I didn't show is actually Private Eyes. What is it in Chinese? But the Hui brothers. So that was actually, it introduced the film in a very prominent way. So, I think, why would a building be continuously brought up by or included in films that really have nothing to really do with it, and repeatedly in very dystopian, like more recently it shows up in Marvel and so on. It's that is something that I'm particularly interested to sort of look into. And the reason why I end up at the last slide, and also to quote the architect, is because its prominence, it's way beyond what it set out to be, that's invisible. And architecture has a visibility that can do much more than simply as a surface one-liner, as a sort of what Batman would want to look at, but rather by really taking it very seriously as how it would appear in all these, we start seeing that actually it does a lot more for the city. And that's something that I'm really interested to look next. Like, how does the city get picked up again by other cultural representations as something in the next phase. Beyond monsters and superheroes, what else is it representing?
Charles, in your presentation, it seems quite clear that you are portraying the building representing a pivotal moment between the old Hong Kong and the new Hong Kong, right? It's very clear that it's almost like the Jardine House kind of sets the bar for the next 50 years of office building in Central. It's a very high bar that they have set. I was just being asked, right? In the past 50 years, you have yet to see a building built in such a way in Central, right? With this kind of punch windows, structural wall. But after this building, most of that kind of receded back to curtain wall. So I've yet to see a beautifully made building in the past 50 years that can surpass, right, the Jardine House. So the pivotal moment is like they have set up the very high, tall order. Now it's kind of like a letdown. So how would you elaborate on that? It all looks the same. And makes the Jardine House looks very unique.
Yes.
Classic.
Yes, especially when you when one look into the sort of a contemporary, like a photograph of the harbor, you will still very easily you can still very easily pick up the Jardine House because not because of its height. As you said, it was once the tallest building not only in Hong Kong but in Asia. But then it was surpassed by another building in the 1980s. So, but even that. Today, when we look at the skyline of the Hong Kong Island, you can still very easily pick up the building because of its very distinguished design on the facade. And like what Eunice has said, even though that kind of the building was, the aesthetics, the uniqueness was being picked up by everyone in the city because of the very unique way how, at the time, very innovative and new way of constructing a skyscraper, because it's really a tall building at the time, the tallest building at the time. The construction itself was a marvel. It's great, a show in the city. In many of these constructions photographs, we will see that there is this kind of gantry at the top, and then it's slowly kind of like almost like ejecting the buildings one story after another. So that in itself is also quite a marvel. Indeed, I think it's a really difficult question to answer. I don't really think that it's can be surpassed because of the context. Because at the time in the 1970s, there were simply no such a building design and no such construction projects at that kind of scale, and so in such a prominent site in the city. So I think if after that, when we look at the constructions of buildings in Hong Kong, in Central, Admiralty, other places, we kind of treat it as a kind of normal thing, right? Especially in Hong Kong, where things really get buildings really get replaced very rapidly. So I really don't think that the site itself, the construction and the design of the building, is really something that can be surpassed.
So moving on to Raymond and Sarah. So you have a very specific way to appreciate, to look at the building, right? Through artwork and through its connectivities, right? How much of the the way how you portrayed it, Raymond, you have posted the question, like which one comes first, between Henry Moore and the building? I think that's a very intriguing question. I don't know if you ever find the answer, which comes first. However, it really precisely it signifies, it really reviews the relationship between when you build a building like this, it starts to talk to the surrounding, and the surrounding talk back to the building, which is what great architecture can do. So it really creates a 50 years long dialogue between its user and its surrounding. So can you maybe share a little bit more about how you see this dialogue can continue to enrich our daily life? I mean, because through photographing and capturing it, and then using the artwork to reframe the building. That's the reason why I said if it's a curtain wall building, then all you see will be reflection of the sky or reflection of the artwork. You will not see the double oval framing the circular window. That's what makes this building, the artwork and the skin of the building, very unique. Because we all know that these days curtain wall is curtain wall. It reflects and it reflects and it reflects. But now this punch window building really is a very distinctive characteristic of the building. So the other things that just continue to what Charles have suggested, besides sensitivity of the client, there's also vision by the clients, which I read. So nothing more than 5-story could be built to the north of the building to ensure highest and maximum visibilities. It will not get lost in the mundaneness of the curtain wall. That requires a lot of sensitivity and visions for the clients to be able to know the impact of such a building for years to come. So maybe Raymond and Sarah can share a little bit more before we open up the questions session to the audience.
Do you hear me? Okay. Well, I still want to, hear from the Jardines or from the Hong Kong land whether the egg come first or the chicken come first, because it's always the time that being architect, or as well as everybody noticed here, we seldom look into where the artworks go, but in this case, even this building is already 50 years old, but so far I think it's still the best in terms of having the art piece in the building and the foreground, which is the landscape, are so unique, are so well coordinated, and therefore I can see any other building so far can surpass it. Now, even Hong Kong Bank, I like the Hong Kong Bank, but you can see the sculpture was put in very late. So of course it's a big piece of work, but whether or not it is so well complemented as this one here, I have questions. Like China Bank, okay? China Bank, of course, I worked with Iron Pei before, so I have to respect him most. But for the art piece, the Juming's art piece, again, was set very late. So you can see that it doesn't go as matching as this one here. So I think the very well matching of all the three pieces, inside, outside, upstairs, they are so unique, and therefore nothing I can find another one. And that comes to the question: is it because the boss knows where to go with the art piece first, rather than go next? Or otherwise, it's always an afterthought. And for afterthought, it never works. And that happens to many of the government buildings in here. Thank you.
So it sounds like that you got some homework for John to work on after today.
Yeah, check with it. Which goes first?
And I think on the other hand, why I try to talk, I actually asked my friend to help me take those nice photos. And it's actually, I think the space as a public space or common area is actually not that big or extensive in a way. However, it has set a very timeless, high quality of what a public space should be. Because in a way, when we talk about public space, we'll start with, can you see it? So everyone can see the Henry Moore artwork. And then can you enter it? You can actually enter the space from all directions. And whether can you find your way in, so it has a lot of connections telling you where you should go, you will never get lost in the space. Whether you can enjoy the space, so which is the fourth layer, is that oh, so you can actually enjoy it on a sunny day, even on a rainy day with purpose, and also help you to connect to other activities or cultural activities around the central area. And lastly, can you recognize it? So I'm sure everyone going there is not just enjoying the space, but together with the buildings, so they can always remember. And so that's why it becomes an icon, not only just a cultural icon, but a daily icon of our life. Yeah.
Thank you for all the panelists. So now is the moment to open the floor to Q&A. I'm sure a lot of anxious people want to ask questions and share their thoughts and their thinkings. We have a microphone on the floor. Yeah. Okay. So we have a question in the front row. Yes. Hi, Joan.
I want to pick up on Raymond's point. I'm particularly sensitive to the way sculptures are placed in Hong Kong. Somehow, I'm sorry to say, it often does not do justice to the artwork. And Jardine House is indeed unique in that respect. But in fact, when I was looking at the one slide of taking down the fountain with Henry Moore in the far background, I was in fact thinking the whole architecture, the ponds, and what's placed inside the pond, the way it works with the canopies, and then Henry Moore at the back. Perhaps it's Jim, who in fact should get the credit, who has produced architecture, and maybe he actually has a say in where to place the sculpture, because his architecture for that particular building is in fact very, very sculptural, quite unlike much of the other buildings in the Jardine's portfolio. And I'm thinking perhaps Jim is responsible for making that very unique character in the way the sculpture is properly placed and selection, etc., etc. Now, I don't know whether Jim wants to respond to that. Or maybe he wants to tell me I'm wrong.
Well, there's quite a bit of discussion regarding artwork and the open space that was created. Perhaps I could give a little background on how the open space was created and how it started the system of elevated walkway that this open space created. When we were designing the building, the plot ratio was 15, but if you give up space on the ground floor for open space for the public to use, then you could get an extra plot ratio of 3. So we discussed this with Hong Kong Land, and they said that the site at that time was isolated from the main shopping area of Central. So they said that they would go and opt for the plot ratio of 3, extra 3. So we designed it for a plot ratio of 18. And that is why it doesn't have a podium, and it created that open space. Regarding the double oval, after when the building was under construction, looking at the open space and the pond and the waterfall, I can't remember who suggested that the Keswicks have a Henry Moore sculpture that they could contribute to the site. And it was a double oval, and that's how it landed on the site. So fortunately, But then when we were applying for the plot ratio of 18, the government said, but I'm not so sure whether you could have the extra plot ratio, because even if you give it up the open space, people can't use it because you're so isolated. There's a huge road, canal road, going across, and people can't get to the site. So we said, okay, we'll build a bridge, we'll pay for it. And so the government agreed to that. And after the bridge was designed, then it was such a good idea that Hong Kong Land then went on to continue this bridge system into Landmark and Alexandra House and so on. It wasn't the first initial initiator of the bridge system, because they already designed a bridge from Mandarin Hotel to Princess Building, but it was only just a short between two properties. But the Jardine House system was much more extensive, and it's started to develop into a whole walkway system in the central.
Wow. There you have it, right? Straight from the source, right? The real stories behind it. Just like in any architectural development, it was premeditated and accidents. So it's both a culmination of all these things that makes great buildings, which is why practicing this profession is fascinating and frustrating at the same time, right? I truly believe that having the walkway system, you were right, having the Prince Building and the Mandarin Building as a first bridge, but having this one on the other end is basically you have two ends of the bridges and the rest start to connect. So you have two endpoints already in place, and the rest of the walkway system becomes who we inhabited today. So this is a fascinating history directly from the source. We're so honored to have Mr. Kinoshita and Mrs. Kinoshita to be present, and Harry Steiner to be on the audience. So we were trying very hard, actually, behind the scene, having this symposium, we told Hong Kong Land that we must invite Mr. and Mrs. Kinoshita as well as Harry Steiner to come and join us. Even if they don't speak, that the presence is already a blessing to the event. Now, to our big surprise, Mr. Kinoshita share the real story. Thank you, Jung, for propping in. Probing for the question. We were too afraid to ask Mr. Kinoshita any questions, because that he can come here, but he prefer not to sit on the stage and talk about the building. It's always very difficult, I'm quite sure, to listen to someone else talking about your baby, right? But nonetheless, I think this is a really wonderful surprise and a very great blessing for all of us. Any other questions from the floor? Okay, wow. Okay, so there's a mic in there.
Thank you. It's loud enough. About the artwork, I think I ought to mention my sort of observation in the past 50 years about Old Central and New Central. And when I was young, I used to be a bank employee, and I've come to work through the staff area and walk diagonally through the building site of now what we call the Jardine House, and towards the old post office building. And you just imagine, without the bridges nowadays, how much risk that one have to take. You have to go across from staff area, across to two main road to central to work. I mean, thank you. This is very fantastic. I mean, Hong Kong Land is not just the first big corporation introducing artwork and bridges to Central, they also introduced a culture of playing with artwork. Let me tell you, share with you two stories. Number one, when Joan mentioned Jim, I thought she was referring to Jim, your former director, Jim Robinson. Jim was the one directly involved in making providing a space for Hon Chi Fun to work within one of the circle to come up with his bigger circles. So Jim was, he must be an intern or a trainee in the Jardine empire in those days. So he was the first manager looking after the setting up of the building and also the artwork itself. So Jim was one of the heroes who helped introduce the artwork to Central and through the ambitious plan of Hong Kong Land. And the other thing is, I think Hong Kong Land is the one of the very peculiar corporate body in Hong Kong, who has the fortune to play around with a few pieces of our Greek sculptors, Henry Moore, because I remember very well the pointed oval was in the same position nowadays as was the double oval. So they thought that maybe one of the executive director of the chairman in those days was kind of annoyed or not happy with what they have in the pond. So they keep on moving the artworks around. I remember very well the double oval was at one time moved over to the corner facing the Jockey Club betting center. So that was a bad decision. You know why? And because on the weekends, we have thousands of helpers, domestic helpers, hugging and rubbing shoulder with the sculpture. So at one time, Hong Kong Land was sort of quite worried that the sculpture has been thinned down to an extent that it begins to have holes at the corners. You can realize the sculpture is still very polished at the corners. So in those days, I was one of the guys who've been commissioned to do something to mend the hold of the sculptures. I actually have gone underneath the sculptures to see the skylight. Actually, it's a porous sculptures. So it's a great work by a German foundry. So I think they have a good eye, I mean, in one way. Before the erections of Jardine House, the only visible Henry Moore sculptures is in the garden of the City Hall. So that was one old piece of Henry Moore borrowed from the British government, I think, when they have the cultural center in Hong Kong. British Council, yes. And it was a whole story. But I think being an artist and being observer of Central, I'm so happy to share a couple of stories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we have one question, one raised hand in the back.
Yeah, Raymond touched on this point very briefly, that when the building was first built, it was clad in, and it's still clad in, actually tiny mosaic tiles that started popping off. Hi, Raymond. Right, I think right after the building was completed, and that the metal panels that are on the building now weren't there originally. They were added sometime in the 80s, as I recall. I'm just wondering, and it was the situation with the mosaic tiles was so bad that Hong Kong Land had to build little covered walkways to get into the building, to all the doors of the building, because the tiles kept popping off and they were hitting people. So they eventually had to build little covered walkways. I'm just wondering, was this a problem of the construction, or was it they weren't properly adhered, or was it the wind loading was making the building move too much, or what have you?
Well, I don't think, well, unless you guys know how to answer that question, it's definitely not in my department. As I've confessed already, when this building was built, I was there already, but my parents took me to walk around the building, and maybe that's the reason why I'm an architect today now. It's imprinted into my memories, subconsciously and consciously. I do remember that it was a mosaic tile exterior, the skin. For the details, why it popped out and all these things, I don't think this panel is in the position to kind of find out. Oh, there's an answer, maybe not an official answer, maybe. So.
No, I'm not going to give any answer. I do remember it popping out, but the moment Peter mentioned this, it reminded me of the glass panels popping out of Hancock.
Yes.
So this is a price to pay for being the first tallest building in the city, probably.
Well, they say that great minds think alike, right? I was exactly thinking the same thing. Actually, what happened to the John Hancock, the popping window? If you listen to what I.M. Pei's response to it, it was really a crisis for the office at the moment. However, it's also the same moment that put I.M. Pei and partners on the map, world map. So they would know, and they find a way to handle and rectify the situation, and from that point, the office just took off in terms of. So therefore, all the buildings have their problems, right? As an architect, we all know that once you send the building out, there's all these surprises. It's the fact that how you deal with those, handling those crises. And I believe that right now, the building with this new metal panel, it works, wonderfully with the way how you, if you really pay attention to the skin right now, the panel, the division, the seam line is all very heavily calculated. So therefore, the quality of the building, as it goes on for the past 50 years, we believe that that's the commitment of the clients to the meaning, the symbol of the building. Jim just mentioned at the very beginning, this is a platinum rated Beam Plus platinum building. We actually received some online questions and talked about, is it really worth preserving a building that's 50 years old? I think Jim give a very John gave a great answer. Is the fact that, of course, it is worth preserving. Of course, you will spend resources to maintain the building because it is a larger than life person. It's not really a building anymore. It's an architecture with a capital A. So therefore, I'm quite sure that the commitment that the client have shown is beyond doubt. So to answer that question from the internet, why? Is it worth it? To me, the most sustainable building is the Pantheon in Rome because it stands for over 2,000 years and never been demolished. So that's a very sustainable building, actually. So you don't have to go through all this greenery testing and rating then. Yes.
I think the reason why I ended with saying that this building could possibly allow those involved to rethink about what can we do with buildings that are existing and older is because at a moment when cities like Hong Kong in particular was going all curtain walling, and no one was discussing carbon or embodied carbon issues and so on. This was a building that actually proportionally between glass and built material was actually the most responsible, I think. And so it's certainly worthwhile to pick that point, celebrate that, and figure how that could potentially be a good model for thinking about these buildings. So the last thing to say is also that if you look around Central now, actually so many buildings reflect this building because everyone else is a curtain wall, a mirror. So.
Yes. Yes.
I understand the Connaught Centre at that time was built on reclaimed land. Is it one of the first tall building in the world on reclaimed land?
historian would address this question.
Oh, wow.
Two historians here. Right? They are more credible.
For Hong Kong, I believe so, in terms of a high rise. In the world, I can't say for a fact because I only know very particular parts of the world. But not in Manhattan, for example. But so, not in Chicago. I think for Asia, for sure. Yeah, because even in Japan was not going this height.
It's highly likely that in Asia it's probably the first tall building that's built on reclaimed land, surely because it's most of the part in Asia they don't need to reclaim lands to begin with, right?
Well,
so Hong Kong already win in that categories. So if you have the reclaimed land, chances are any kind of building that you build would be new, and the tall building on the reclaimed land, I'm quite sure probably in Asia. Right.
True, because Singapore was also a lot of reclamation. But in terms of schedule, timing, Hong Kong first. Like that happened in Singapore in the 80s.
Yeah, I understand that because at that time, you can imagine in the 60s, the reclaimed land technology is actually very, very new. And I wonder how it was being as a challenge for the architect and the construction engineers as a project. How did they overcome that?
Again, this is probably not this panel within the realm of this panel. Jim, would you like to take on that question about reclamations and the tower and the fact that it's built on reclaimed land? Did it present any engineering challenges for building on such a site?
I'm sorry, but I didn't quite get the question.
On reclaimed land is on reclaimed land, the Connaught Road. The question was, did it present any engineering challenges to build such a tall and heavy building on reclaimed land when the technology was not, like today in the 60s?
Well, it was a challenge in that it is a reclaimed land, but when we first started to design the building, Hong Kong Land insisted that this building, they wanted the building built as quickly as possible. Time is very important because they paid such a large sum for this site at that time. It was the highest price at that time, that they wanted to get the building finished and get the return as quickly as possible. So discussing with the engineer as to how to build the building quickly on reclaimed land, they said the caisson is the best way. It goes right down to rock. But caisson takes a long time, especially at that depth. So they said we have used piles. So they said in order to build it on piles, you have to build the building as light as possible. So we were confronted with the idea of building a building that's light as possible. So we designed the building to be a shell and with an empty space inside, excepting the floors. And so there's no column and beam system. It's a you might say, exoskeleton. And by doing an exoskeleton tower, we were able to get the building as light as possible and therefore using piles. And that's how we got rid of solving the...
Within budget.
Great, thank you. So we have chance for one last question. Yes, please.
No, I think I can answer that last question because I'm an architect engineer also. Hong Kong, underneath it, it's granite. It's a very strong rock. And of course, I came here in the early 70s to build Kwai Chung, the container terminal. It's all reclaimed land. We use caissons I did ATL, the other building in there. But basically, if you look on the Wikipedia, the city with the #1 in the world of high-rise buildings, it's Hong Kong. It's because underneath is granite. So if it's reclaimed land, you just have to dig deeper to get to the granite. But of course, it takes time.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Anderson and the panel. You may now be seated. Thank you very much. And next up, we would like to let's welcome back Mr. John Simpkins, Executive Director and General Counsel of Hong Kong Land, back to the stage for closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ada. Anderson and your wonderful panel, thank you so much. That was really, really engaging, fascinating. I think we all learned a lot. You, Anderson, were summarizing as we went along, so I will not try to summarize myself because I will do a much worse job than you. But we've had a wonderful journey through time, and I think we've also looked at this amazing building through different aspects as well, both from the sort of the cultural, the art, the art side, as well as from the architectural aspect as well. And James, thank you so much. I think you've taught us so much in the last sort of 10, 20 minutes, and more than I think any book actually contains about Jardine House. So that really is an honor, I think, that all of us have had by being here and listening to you. So thank you very much as well. So. And of course, thank you, Surfer, as well for your contribution as well. That was really great, and everyone who's shared and made today as exciting and informative as possible. So a couple of bits of admin, I think, before we close up. There are some cameras floating around, and to the extent that anyone wants to share their experiences about your time in Jardine House, feel free to. I think that'd be absolutely wonderful and part of the ongoing history that we're putting together for Jardine House. There's also some drinks at the bar as well, so feel free to socialize and catch up and enjoy a little bit more of this wonderful event. Thank you for coming this weekend, taking your time out, and enjoy the rest of the day. Have a great weekend. Thank you very much.